Hi, welcome to Gemcraft Studio here at Shop LC. I'm Sara Lovecraft, and today we're going to be creating a beautiful bracelet using minimal materials. We're going to be using some beautiful freshwater pearls, and I'm going to show you how to use a button as a clasp. Let's get into it. So for today's project, we're going to be using just some of our basic tools. We're going to be using our cutter tool to cut our bead stringing wire, as well as our leather. If you prefer not to use your cutter tool blades to cut your leather, you can also grab a pair of scissors. We're going to be using our crimper tool. I'm going to show you the proper technique to crimping, up close and personal, every step. We're also going to be using a combination of our chain nose pliers and our bent chain nose pliers to open and close our jump rings. We're going to create the stringing portion of this project first. We're going to be using some of our beautiful freshwater pearls, and we're placing size 11 seed beads in between those pearls to create a little bit of space and also a little bit of sparkle. But before we can do that, we need to crimp the end of our wire. That's going to hold all of our beads on the ends. So first things first, we're going to use a crimp tube in combination with a wire guardian. The crimp tubes are tiny little beads, not to be mistaken for your spacer beads or your 11-0 seed beads here. They are very small and similar in size, but they're shaped like a tube. You're going to pick up one of your crimp tubes and you're going to thread that on to the end of your bead stringing wire. Holding your crimp tube 1.5 to 2 inches from the end of your bead stringing wire, then you're going to thread on your wire guardian. Your wire guardian has 2 tubes on each side, very similar to your crimp tube. You're going to thread your beading wire up through one of the tubes on the side of the wire guardian. You're going to take your bead stringing wire up, down the side, and when you pull the wire down, you're going to be pulling that wire into a channel that holds your bead stringing wire. That's going to be the protective surface that separates your bead stringing wire from your jump rings or your clasp or whatever hardware you have that you're going to attach to this. So that bead stringing wire is sitting safely inside the groove of the wire guardian. Then you're going to take the tail end, that's the short end of your bead stringing wire, and you're going to go back down through your crimp tube running in the opposite direction. Pull your crimp tube down close to your wire guardian, but not right up against it. And you want to be sure that your wires are running parallel inside your crimp tube. Those wires should be on completely opposite sides of the inside of the crimp tube. You're now going to use your crimper tool to help further separate those wires. So make sure they're not crisscrossing over each other, because when we crimp, we don't want to crush the wire. Bringing in the crimper tool, we're going to place the crimp into the back notch of the crimper tool. I'm using my fingers to make sure that those wires remain on opposite sides of the crimp tube, and I am gently going to squeeze. With that first squeeze, you're bringing the tooth portion of the crimper tool down, and it is further separating out those wires. So now you have crushed the tube so that it is actually between the two wires. Then you're going to take your crimp tube and you're going to place it into the front notch of your crimper tool sideways. So you just want to give that a little bit of a turn, make sure that it is facing up and down, place that into the front notch of the crimper tool and give that a squeeze. That second squeeze with your crimper tool is not necessarily to crimp, because that has already happened in the previous step. This is just to tidy up that crimp tube and make it a little bit smaller. At this point, you can place on a crimp cover if you want to, or you can just leave it as is. Now, if you've crimped properly, you have 2 options at this point. You can go ahead and trim off the tail, that is that short piece of wire, or you can leave it behind, thread a bead or 2 over the top of it, and then trim off the excess wire. But since the first bead that I'm using is going to be a seed bead, my seed bead won't fit over both wires, so I'm going to go ahead and trim off that excess bead stringing wire. Using my cutter tool, I'm going to come in as close as I can to that crimp to trim off the excess. That leaves me with a single wire, and now I'm ready to string. For our project today, we are going to be alternating our size 11 seed beads with our beautiful freshwater pearls. I'm going to start with my seed bead. So I've thread my seed bead on. I'm going to drop that down and let that land right next to my crimp tube and my wire guardian. Next, I'm going to thread on one of my pearls. I'm going to drop that down and let that sit next to the previous bead. We're going to continue this pattern, alternating between our seed beads and our pearls. Using the seed beads in between each one of the pearls gives each pearl a moment to shine. With freshwater pearls and other gemstones that have a more natural shape, they all have their own personality. So you're going to notice they're going to have different sizes, different little inconsistencies that make them each individually beautiful. All right, for my bracelet, I have thread on about 14 of the pearls. If you need a longer bracelet, obviously adding more pearls will help with that, but we're also going to be able to adjust the size of this when we get to the clasp portion with the leather and the button. I'm going to thread on my last seed bead and we're going to crimp again. Crimping at this stage is basically the same as when you started. However, we're working up against beads, so we have to be a little bit more cautious and careful when we are pulling our wires down. We're working in less area, so we don't have as much room to get in there with our fingers to separate those wires out, but it can be done. Let me show you how. First things first, we're going to thread on our crimp tube. And then just like before, we're going to thread on our wire guardian. You're taking the wire up through the wire guardian. Pull out some of the length, and then you're going to take your bead stringing wire down through the wire guardian. And then you're going to go down through your crimp tube. When you thread your wire back down through your crimp tube, you'll be able to see which side of that crimp tube your tail wire is on. And if you let go of it, it's going to want to twist on you a little bit. So be sure that you're holding it nice and still, and you're going to pull out all of the slack, pulling your crimp down next to your last bead in your stringing section. Now that I have pulled the crimp down, you can see I'm holding the wires on opposite sides of the crimp. So I'm holding that tail wire off to the left, and I'm separating out with my hand the stringing section with the long wire. So those wires are on opposite sides of that crimp tube. Holding on to everything, making sure that nothing is going to move on me, I'm going to place that crimp into the back notch of my crimper tool, holding everything still. I'm going to give a gentle squeeze. And just like before, that's going to bring that notch in the back notch of that crimper tool down to separate those wires inside that crimp. I'm going to turn that sideways, place that into the front notch of my crimper tool, and give that a squeeze to tidy up the crimp. Once you have crimped, you can trim off the excess wire. Use your cutter tool to get as close as you can to your crimp and trim your wire. Now that you have completed the stringing section of your bracelet, you're going to set this to the side and we're going to work on the clasp. Now that we have finished the stringing section of our bracelet, we're going to work on the leather and the button for the clasp, but we need to add a jump ring first. Using a large jump ring, we're going to hold that between our bent chain nose pliers and our chain nose pliers, and we are going to twist to open our jump ring. Before we thread this on to one of the wire guardians on the end of our stringing project, we're actually going to add a charm to this. So we're going to slide the charm on, and then before we close the jump ring, go ahead and slide on one of the wire guardians on the end of your beaded section. Using your chain nose pliers, hold the jump ring steady and twist to close. Now we're going to use the leather to tie an overhanded knot. Keeping the leather cord running parallel, create a loop. Take your two ends through the loop, and then you're going to pull. You want to pull the knot as close to your jump ring as you can get it. You may need to readjust your knot just a little bit to make sure that that happens, and tighten down by pulling each side of your leather cord. Once you've created the knot, now we are going to tie another knot, but what we need to do is we need to space it out so that our button will fit between the two knots. So essentially we're creating a buttonhole out of the leather cord. So before we tie the knot, bring in your button that you're going to be using for your clasp and lay it up against the leather to decide how far over you need your second knot to be. I need my second knot to be about 1.5 inches from the first knot. So holding the leather with my fingers to mark the area, I'm going to hold that and tie another overhanded knot by looping the leather around, taking the two ends through the loop, and I'm going to pull. And again, to cinch your knot down, you want to hold the knot and pull each end of the leather cord. At this point, you can cut off the leather, leave as much as you want behind. I kind of like to have a little bit of fringe behind, but if you don't want it to be too long, you can come in with your cutter tool or with your scissors and trim off. I'm going to leave about 1 inch behind. Now the last step to this project is just adding the button for the clasp. We're going to use a 6mm jump ring with 2 pairs of pliers. Holding the jump ring between our 2 pairs of pliers, we're going to twist to open the jump ring. We're going to thread that on to the opposite end of our beaded section on the wire guardian. And before we close the jump ring, we're going to thread on the shank on the back of our button. Once you've thread on your button, hold the jump ring between 2 pairs of pliers and twist to close. Now your bracelet is complete. You're going to take your button and you're going to thread it through your newly created buttonhole with your leather cord. Now that your bracelet is complete, you have a really nice combination of the boho chic with the leather, as well as that classy elegance with those beautiful freshwater pearls. And you have the bonus of the button clasp, which is very easy to use to take your bracelet off and to put your bracelet on. I'm Sara Lovecraft here at Gemcraft Studio with Shop LC. I hope you've enjoyed today's project. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments section, would you use one of these button clasps in your design, or what are some of your other favorite clasps that are functional but also cute?